Thanks for joining me today, and we're going to paint using Holbein Watercolours this lovely street scene in Italy, a group of figures outside a little church. So first of all, we're going to you do a thumbnail sketch. It's so important to map out your lights and darks before you even put your brush on the paper. If you can do that, half the problems will be solved for you, because with watercolour, you really have to work out well in advance exactly what you're going to do. And if you can do this, sometimes you think, I can't be bothered making a sketch, but it's really worthwhile, because you'll be able to work out, for example, the exact shape of the door, how that shadow, which is what I loved when I took the photo, slants across that doorway. Where does everything fit in? And if you can get your proportions correct there, and then you map down, I call it, you map across your paper and then you plumb a line down, and everything will link up with something else. So you can see there that the shadow slants right across behind those people, and if I hadn't done a thumbnail sketch, I probably would have missed that altogether. You'll also see that the figures are in front of that beautiful cast iron lamp on the left-hand side. And it's really important, if you're going to do some figures, try and overlap them. Even if the ones you're painting aren't in a group that overlaps, squish them closer together. It makes for a far more interesting painting. Now, thank heavens I'm doing a thumbnail sketch, because I've completely missed this lovely figure. You'll be able to see it in the original photograph, but he's kind of ghosted just in there in deep shadow, and I loved the look of that. I've drawn him way too high, but that's okay. It's a thumbnail sketch. So in a thumbnail sketch, you can also get everything in place where you want it, and if you make a mistake, it doesn't matter. It's only on a scrap of paper. It doesn't have to be as large as this, but because this was a class demo, I really wanted to get my lights and darks in quickly so that everybody could see the advantage of doing a thumbnail sketch. It doesn't have to be the world's best drawing, it's just a sketch. So there's no pressure to do fabulous work here. It's just a sketch, but gosh, it helps you. It really, really helps you. Another issue I used to have when I first started painting was I always drew the figures too close to the bottom of the paper, and I've done it again here, which is great, because when I do my painting, I'm going to put them further up the paper so that I don't make a mistake and make them look like they're falling off the bottom of the paper. It's such an easy mistake to make. I've also got my lamp way too high as I'm sort of sitting here doing the voiceover, and I can see that. But that's great, because when I come to do my proper painting, I'll think, gosh, Jude, your lamp's too tall. You've got to make that shorter, because it's probably twice the distance above the people. It's twice as high as the people, which mine's about 2.5 times. The other thing I loved about this image is the legs, all those lovely positive and negative shapes between the legs. So you've got shadows going from one person across the legs of the person behind, and it makes for a really interesting sketch. It makes for a really interesting painting. So if you're doing your thumbnail sketch, and even if you don't want to, you'll find it will just help you so much to map everything out and get everything in its place. So there we have the finished thumbnail sketch. And now I've inserted the original image up above on the left. So I'm going to transfer it across to my watercolour paper, which is a 1/4 sheet that I'm using. So holding the pencil right at the end so I can just very lightly do my marks on the paper. I'm using a 2B mechanical pencil, which gives me just enough. It's not really light enough. Sorry, it's not really dark enough for you to see in the video, but it's dark enough for me to see on my watercolour paper. I don't want it too dark in case I need to erase some lines after. So I'm just sketching these figures in loosely and randomly. I don't sort of want to do too much detail. The more detail you do, the more detail you've got to put everywhere. So I just want to block in their shapes. But I do want to get the legs correct and the proportions of the body correct. So if you look at the original image, you'll see that the length of the skirts on the two ladies are, if you map across the paper, they're almost the same length. So take care and see where your jackets go on the bodies, where their legs go, where the trouser lines finish for the men. And the good thing is, don't do feet. You do not need feet when you're sketching in figures, because we've got such dark shadows at the base of the figures, their feet will disappear into those shadows. And I'll show you how. It's great fun. So here's a close-up work. And you can see how I'm just mapping across, okay, you know, this hand on this figure, or the legs there, and the head of the fellow behind comes just a bit lower. He must be shorter than the man in front of him. He's got a longish coat on and he's further forward, so would make his legs a bit longer when we paint it. Now here's my ghost figure, as we all called it, and I thought I'd have a go at doing this. I've actually not done this before, but I thought I'd love to do just a suggestion of a figure. I want the proportions correct, but I don't want him to be too strong, because he will detract from the group of figures, which is the focus of the painting. But I do want to put something there. In the original photograph, he's actually got his hand on the back of a car, but I didn't want to do that. So that's my sketch, my thumbnail sketch, all done. And you can see that it's nice and dark. I've resolved everything. And here's my completed sketch on my watercolour paper. You can see here too that I have put the figures much higher up the paper than they were on my thumbnail sketch. It's always good to have loads of foreground, because you can run shadows there or you can just have nothing there. It depends on your style of painting. So I'm going to start with those gorgeous shadows. So I'm mixing up here burnt sienna, and as I realise now, I've gone right across the top of the arched doorway. Oh well, we'll just make it a straight across door frame. It doesn't matter. So at the end of that stroke, so that it doesn't form harsh lines on my paper, I'm going to just soften those out. If I don't, it'll be very hard to ever join anything in with that shadow. Always keep your shadows warm. So if you wanted to make this shadow darker, which I will when I come back a little later, I would put ultramarine blue in with the burnt sienna. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna are my go-to darks. If ever I want a dark shadow in a doorway, windows, very strong shadows on a tree trunk, I always use ultramarine and burnt sienna. So you can make it quite cool and strong by putting very little water with your paint, or you can have it quite warm by adding more burnt sienna. And as you can see here, I'm just dragging all those darks out with loads of water, and I do mean loads of water. That water, there's enough water on my paper to make that paint flow all over the surface where I move my brush. Because these shadows are all going to be very soft, I need to paint them wet in wet. So wet in wet is when you drop one colour in, it will merge with all the other colours around it. And you get lovely granulations and gradations forming. And I also want to be able to introduce other colours and temperatures of other colours into those shadows. So I don't want all my shadows warm and I don't want all of my shadows cool. So I mix it up. So I've got some Cobalt Blue here and I'm mixing it with my lovely Quinacridone Red. It makes a beautiful, soft colour in a shadow. So, and when you paint wet in wet like this, it's very hard to make a mistake because it all merges together. If you didn't like any of that, you could just get some kitchen paper, press down hard on the paint, and it will just lift off. Then you'd have to re-wet the surface and start again. But it's hard to make a mistake when your paper is all wet like this and everything is merging beautifully on the paper. So now I've mixed up some yellow ochre and I'm going to do a little bit of, there's some writing on that stone, I suppose it's a stone tablet or a plinth above the doorway. Just sort of doing some random marks that look hopefully like a little bit of printing. Maybe there's some scrolls and things there. And I'm also just wherever there's shadows being cast by that sun, I am putting those on the paper. So at this stage, it's still just yellow ochre that I've used in those darker shadows on that stone. Now, if the burnt sienna from the shadow runs into the building, that's fantastic. It's actually even better because it will look harmonious. It won't look like you've painted every single thing in. Personally, I find buildings quite difficult to paint, and I have to think quite hard every time I go to paint a building because I'm never really that happy with my results. So while I want this to look sketchy, I also want the structure of the building to look reasonably decent. So some of those shadows are a little bit darker, and because that paint is still wet, if you just touch your wet brush with your paint onto those wet marks, they'll just see how that now looks. I think that looks great. Very soft, barely there, but you get the idea that yes, there's a shadow there without it looking like it's been painted laboriously. You don't ever have to paint exactly what you see. For instance, the colours that I want in my painting are much warmer than the stonework that's actually in the photograph. So it is just an inspiration to use to do the painting. I want to be able to paint something more than what I'm actually looking at. So hopefully I can pull it off. We'll see. And I couldn't paint that section of doorway there that doesn't have any shadow on it before, because it would have run into the warm woodwork up above it. So I've chosen to paint that later when it's dried up enough for me to paint. And then the shadows sort of all bleed in to one another and look almost barely there, almost look kind of unpainted. And you can see how it's very wet and that paint is all merging and looking harmonious on the paper, and it's still lovely wet in wet, although where the doorway is, the top left hand corner of the doorway, it was wet paint on dry paper, and it's got lovely skips where it has been dry paper with the brush being taken over the top. So now I can strengthen the door frame behind the figures where it's in deep shadow. And I think when I first started painting, I always tried with buildings too hard, and I made it so difficult to do. But in this painting, I'm just sort of going for it basically and thinking, okay, if it doesn't work, it's just a piece of paper. Yes, I've spent a long time drawing up and trying to get it to look how I wanted, but no practice is wasted when you're painting. So it's all good. So to get some, what would I say? How could I term this? To get some lively contrast happening, shadows are quite difficult to paint. Well, not difficult, but you have to think about them. So to get those shadows to look interesting, the actual photograph is really boring. I don't want it to look like that, just dark, dark shadow. So if you throw some different colours in, so the opposite of purple is yellow, and that really bounces off. It really makes it look so much more interesting than the original photograph. The strong paint that I've painted down the outside of the building there, I'm just dragging that out with the tip of a just damp paintbrush. And always remember that no surface on your paper will ever be as bright as unpainted paper. So where I've got the lamp on this painting, I'm not painting over it at all. I'm just going to leave it as unpainted paper. So I forgot to say that my purple is Cobalt Blue and a little bit of Quinacridone Red. And you can see that how I've just wet that back wall of the building with water and splattered that with a soft mauve. That will spread out and merge beautifully on the paper and make some marks that look really interesting and will really jazz up that section of the work without taking any interest away from the group of figures, which is where my focal point is. Into the section here on the paper, I've just flicked some water, so that will give you a lovely, it'll make the pigment spread. You can see how wet that is. It's a shiny wet. So that paint is still moving on the paper. It's not in its final section yet. It's not set. Watercolour is the only medium that keeps moving and changing until it's completely dry. Now, I must apologise here because this is actually from the previous class. I completely missed filming. I forgot to turn the filming on for the afternoon class for the figures. So I'm switching back to the morning class, which was quite similar, but in the morning class I did the figures first and the background last. So this is the other way around. So I'm doing just some darks for the figure on the left. She had a lovely yellow shirt on, and the lady next to her has got cobalt turquoise. I think it's a big wrap over her shoulder, a big scarf. So just do some cobalt turquoise, which is a lovely foil for the bright yellow. And I've used cad yellow orange for the t-shirt on the lady on the left. She's blonde, so I'm just putting down yellow ochre, and there's a little bit of cobalt going up into that, which is great because that will look like shadow at the back of her head. Let your figures, the clothing on your figures, I should say, let them merge together. Always let the jackets and trousers, for example, merge together. Don't have each item delicately painted. It means you've got to do your whole painting in the same style. So these are very casual. They're very, just put down plenty of thick paint, and then I'm dragging it out with some water. And that way I can get sort of skips on the paper so that it looks really interesting rather than just flat painting. Her legs, I'm just going to do that in some yellow ochre and a little bit of Quinacridone Red. So now I'm using a chisel brush, which is really good to lift off any paint that is too dark while it's still damp. So the front of the lady on the left, who has very dark hair, I've just lifted a little bit of dark off her face because the shadow will run in behind her, and I want her hair to be lighter than the shadow behind her so that she will stand out. For the face of the fellow who is behind the blonde lady, I'm using a little bit of Quinacridone Red and some yellow ochre. He's got quite a dark jacket on, which looks really good against the light and bright clothing of the girl in front. He's also chosen to wear a yellow jacket, which is just fabulous for our painting. So just one single brush stroke of cad yellow, and I've mixed a bit of aureolin yellow with that so I can get some skips on the paper and get it looking more interesting than if I'd painted it laboriously. So for the trousers, I'm using burnt sienna and quite a lot of ultramarine blue because I want them to be a cool dark because he's behind the lady in front. So again, there's that brush stroke, the dry brush, so you have skips of white showing through, and that's all you need to do for his legs. Got a little bit of turquoise going up into his face, which is not a good look. So you can just blot that dry and leave it until it dries a lot more, and we can restate his face. Restate just means you can repaint it again. So I've made the jacket just a bit lighter than the trousers, and I'm moving on to the jacket of the next figure in our group. I'm exaggerating the colour in his jacket because in the photograph it's just quite dull. Again, just quickly drag your brush down for the trousers. And if you do figures wider at the hips and narrow at the feet, they will look just fine Because the jacket is lighter at the back than it is at the front's in shadow, just with a just damp brush, I have dragged a little bit of water onto the back of his jacket, so that should bleed back just enough to give you the contrast between the bright sunlight on his back and the jacket where it's in shadow. And again, some Quinacridone Red and some yellow ochre for the faces. And to get the look of the jacket again, just use water. That pigment is so thick that the water will just get the paint to seep back onto the sunlit back of the fellow on the outside of the group.